Two balls and a strike to count on Taylor. Reyes fires, swinging a drive, deep left field. This is way back. Walk the ball. Chris Taylor.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. My name is Jeff Spiegel. In just a moment, you're going to see an interview I did with Jim Alexander, who has covered the Dodgers as a journalist for a number of years and recently wrote a book that's sort of a history of the Dodgers. It's a great interview, but I wanted to make one note about it as well as give you one quick announcement before we get into it. The first note is this. The interview was recorded about 6 days before the regular season ended, so there's a couple moments in there where we'll say something that now, having known how the last 7 or 8 days of the season would play out, may sound a little funky. So just wanted to let you know that wasn't him making a mistake or me making a mistake. It's just an interview that got recorded and didn't get posted because we had so much other stuff come up. The second is, as the NLDS is just around the corner, I wanted to make sure you knew that every single night we are going to have a ton of content. We'll be doing short 10-minute pregame shows here on YouTube on the Dodger Blue 1958 YouTube channel, so make sure to subscribe, ring the notification bell for that. Then we're going to send everybody over to Playback, where we'll be doing live watch parties with tons of Dodger fans. We'll be able to interact, chat with one another. That's going to be a blast. And then in a lot of cases, we'll be right back here on YouTube doing postgame shows. If you're a podcast person, those postgame shows will be available for podcast versions the day after. So just make sure to check those out with us as the Dodgers go into the NLDS against the Padres. If you missed our full preview with Justin Norber and Matt Moreno, make sure you check that out as well on podcast form or YouTube. But enough of that. Let's get into the interview. Here's my interview with Jim Alexander. What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com. My name is Jeff Spiegel. Today we are joined by Jim Alexander, sports columnist for the Southern California News Group, who covered the Dodgers back in the 70s and 80s, been writing columns about them ever since. He's got a new book coming out called Dodgers, An Informal History from Flatbush to Chavez Ravine. Jim, we appreciate your time. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's a good time to be a Dodgers fan, I would say, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I mean, they're going to get win number 107 at some point, probably in the next couple of days. And this, just from the standpoint of offensive capability and from the standpoint of dominating the landscape. I mean, this 5 or 6 year run that they've been on is equal to any in the history of the franchise. And this particular team may be the best. I mean, it remains to be seen, because to be the best, you got to win that final game. So the jury's still out. But I mean, as far as a regular season dominance is concerned, I mean, this is the best of a group of really good teams over the last 5 or 6 years, dating back to 2017.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you some questions about your book here in just a moment, but that's kind of where I wanted to start. As I said, you were on the beat in the 70s and into the late 80s, and so you've watched this team, you've followed this team sort of closely from afar, as a fan, as a journalist, all of the above, and that's what I wanted to ask you. I mean, you said it, they're about to set the franchise, as we record this, they haven't yet set the franchise wins record, but we expect they will at some point in the next 8 days. I think if they need to go 5-3 in their last 8 games in order to set the full season win percentage record for the franchise, of course, 2020, that mark will never be equaled as far as a win percentage goes. But I mean, that's what I was going to ask. Is this the best regular season team? Because record-wise, it is, and you could argue that the division, it's not like it's a cakewalk of a division with the Padres there. So how does this team compare to some of the other teams? Are there eras or teams that this reminds you of?
I said this to somebody the other day, that what it reminded me of is what it must have been like in 1955 in Ebbets Field to watch that team go out there every day. And I was 1 year old. So I have no personal experience there. Okay. But I mean, just from the standpoint of a dominant lineup, a group of 8, or in this case, a group of 9 every day, more or less, with a few guys in and out. But I mean, you've got a lineup here that can mash with anybody. You've got, I mean, the 3 at the top of the lineup, Betts and Trey Turner and Freeman. I mean, to me, that's unmatched. I mean, if you could give MVP to a group, I'd say that those three would be the MVP. But then you go, I mean, guys have been in and out, and guys have been slumping or what have you. But it seems like Muncie's back on the beam. Justin Turner's back on the beam. Chris Taylor is even starting to show some signs of life. You've got a guy like Trace Thompson. You've got a guy like Joey Gallo. This is the best bench that they've had since those 2017, 2018 teams. And I mean, it's hard to imagine. And the other thing about this is their pitching has been so good, and yet it's been so unsettled with so many guys on the injured list over the season. I think that puts it in even greater perspective that they're about to win their 107th game, and they've had something like, 14, 15 guys on the injured list as far as pitchers. And, that's more than you're allowed to have as a pitching staff these days. So to me, the whole package has just been amazing.
Yeah, I mean, for them to do this without their ace, Walker Buehler, who was average to below average and then hurt, without their probably number one relief pitcher coming into the season, Blake Trinan, without their traded for closer who has technically been present but has been completely underwhelming to the point that he might not even make the postseason roster. So if I told you all of those narratives and said, oh, by the way, Bellinger's still going to struggle, Chris Taylor's going to be really bad, but they're going to set the franchise record for wins and probably the full season record for win percentage, it's a pretty remarkable thing, as you point out, when you put it in that context. And as we're going to get into a moment, you're kind of a historian of sorts for this team. And so I think that's a helpful perspective to have. I mean, let me ask you one last question before we dive into the book. Like, as somebody who's been following this team for as long as you have, did you think this type of thing was possible? Like, could you ever have imagined 9 division titles in 10 years and 4 consecutive seasons from 2019 to 2022? Like we've seen, not to mention that you could argue that the best still lies in front of this team, the way the young guys and the guys they have under contract. Like, could you have ever seen this as possible?
Probably not, but I think it speaks to the commitment of Guggenheim and the commitment of current ownership, and the idea that they recognize in Los Angeles winning is important. There's none of this 2 or 3 year competitive cycle and then we got to tear it down and start over again. That does not work in LA. And these guys have recognized that, and they've recognized, whether it was Ned Colletti before or since Friedman took over, the idea that you have to make that big acquisition when the chance comes. You can't just say, well, we're just gonna tread water. You can't do that in this market. And the other thing, I don't know, over the first few years of this streak, I was thinking maybe it was just that everybody was so darn happy that Frank McCourt was gone that there was an after effect. But I mean, it's beyond that. And it speaks to the way they run this organization, the way they develop players, the way they develop pitchers, both minor league and guys that they've brought over and managed to unlock something. I mean, it just speaks to maybe the best run organization in baseball, to be able to do this well for this long and still have so much ahead of them.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And again, it's crazy to think that, they've got arguably the best farm system in baseball. They could have traded for Juan Soto. They decided not to. They've got the young guys on the roster. I mean, you look at guys under team control for the next 3 to 5 years, and it's, 80% of the bullpen, 60% of the rotation, and, aside from Trey Turner, basically the entirety of the lineup can come back next year if the Dodgers want them to. So, yeah. Crazy stuff. Well, let's get into your book, Dodgers: An Informal History from Flatbush to Chavez Ravine, released in July, as I said. I love when I get to talk to somebody who's written a book. To me, almost more interesting than the book is the story behind the book, like why this book was written. And so what drove you to write this book, Jim, as you sat here having covered the team? What drove you to say, I need to write this book?
Well, the origin story, and I've related this to Jim Hill on Channel 2, and he had a little fun with it. But I'm sitting in the back seat of the family car. We're on road trip to Oregon. We're on a vacation trip up to Oregon. And I've got my iPad out and I'm just fooling around with some concepts. And I'm thinking, well, I might do a compilation of columns or what have you and get a book out of that or something like that. And I'm looking at all the Dodger stuff I have. And in particular, I'm looking at all the Lasorda stuff I have. And I'm thinking, there could be a way to transform this into a book. And it's going to take some digging. It's going to take some research and what have you, and going back through interviews and whatnot. But there's a path here. So I like to say that the book was born in the backseat of the family car, and we'll leave it at that. But no, I mean, once I got into it, and it was like about a 2.5-year process to really get it into shape to publish. Going back through that history and going all the way back, it's beyond the 40s, beyond the 20s, all the way back to 1883 when the club was first formed as a minor league club and it joined the American Association the next year. And going back through the way the game was played, the conditions under which the game was played. And it was different then. It was a lot different. The rules were different. I guess it took a while for them to decide that it was okay to pitch overhand, but the idea that so much of this has happened and there's so much rich history behind this franchise. And then the fact that there were certain threads that kept reappearing as you go deeper into that history. The sign stealing, we'll get to that in a bit. But it's just fascinating. And I defy anyone to say that any other club has had as interesting a history as this one has. Maybe you can make that case with the Yankees. I mean, I'm sure New Yorkers will be glad to try. And I'm sure there are other clubs that have equally rich histories, but this is, I think it's an interesting read because there's so much here and there's so much that's happened in so many different ways to where if you are reciting the history of baseball, you can't do it without the Dodgers.
You say that they might have the most interesting history. I mean, how would you kind of sum up what makes them interesting? Obviously, you've got the origins, you've got the move across the country, you've got Jackie Robinson, you've got Fernando Valenzuela. I mean, is it as simple as kind of what somebody like me could just deduce from looking big picture and say it's a famous franchise? They moved across the country, which was sort of a new thing. Jackie Robinson, all these barriers that they broke, or is there something even deeper than that?
That's some of it. I mean, you can make the case that there are a lot of firsts involved with this franchise, but I do think it goes deeper than that because there have been a lot of characters that have played for this team and for this franchise. I mean, you just going back to the team that won, the team that got to the World Series for the first time. Okay. And there's an asterisk here because it was called the World's Series. It was in 1889. And I had this issue last fall with all the pundits that said, well, this is the first time the Dodgers and Giants have played in the postseason, which was absolutely wrong. 1889. I believe it was 80. It was either 88 or 89. It was one of those two. It's in the book. But the Brooklyn Bridegrooms won the American Association. The New York Giants won the National League. And they played in the postseason a best of 11 series. And Brooklyn lost. That was a precursor of things to come. But those franchises have played in the postseason. And I felt like I was shouting into the wind, but I've got the evidence on my side. It's in the book.
There you go. Well, I mean, you mentioned something like that. Like, do you have a favorite nugget or a favorite story that sort of came out of the process? And maybe it's something you've learned, maybe it's something you had a greater appreciation for, or maybe it's just something that you were reminded of. Is there a nugget or a story to you that sort of captures the essence of what you were after with this book?
There are so many, but one in particular, and it goes back to 1966. when Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale did their twin holdout. They wanted to be signed. They wanted to negotiate as a package deal, and Walter O'Malley and Buzzy Bavasi said, no, we're not going to do that. So the stalemate lasted through most of spring training. As I found out, and this was in Sandy Koufax's autobiography that he published in 1966. Okay, and I read it as a kid. It didn't occur to me at the time how important this was. Excuse me. Bill Hayes was an entertainment lawyer, and Koufax had enlisted him to represent them and to be their advocate in this holdout in this contract negotiation. Well, Bill Hayes was familiar enough with the entertainment industry. He went back and did some digging about the entertainment contracts, the movie star contracts and whatnot, and noticed that under California law, I mean, these were like the entertainment counterpart of the reserve clause. They would bind someone to a particular studio for life.
Got it.
Except that Bill Hayes found out that under California law, the maximum term for one of those contracts was 7 years. So Koufax and Drysdale are thinking, we could sue for free agency. We could sue to become free agents. And this was a decade before free agency actually was won by the Players Association and Marvin Miller. I mean, this was even before Marvin Miller. The Players Association was kind of small time, and they basically were worried about the pension plan and nothing else. And Bavasi and O'Malley were smart enough, once they got word, once they found out, I'm sure they found out, I'm not sure how, but all of a sudden they were much more willing to negotiate and to give the guy, they didn't give him exactly what they wanted. They didn't give him, Koufax asked for a 3-year contract, and he wasn't going to play 3 years anyway. He knew the year before that he was going to quit after that season because his elbow was just it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
But they got those 1-year contracts. They got a nice bump in pay, and Major League Baseball was able to avoid the loss of the reserve clause for another decade.
Wow. And those are the things that it's like the beauty of books like this is that it makes sure those types of stories are not lost to history.
Yeah.
One other guy you mentioned, Tommy Lasorda, is a guy that it sounds like you probably got to know pretty well from your years of covering. And look, I mean, what I'm about to ask you is an impossible question to ask you for just one Tommy Lasorda story when I'm sure that you have 25 that you could pull whenever you need them. To somebody like myself, who Lasorda was sort of just before my time, as far as seeing him in real time, somebody my age heard the stories from the generation above me. But how would you describe Tommy Lasorda? And is there a particular story that sort of, again, captures the heart and that sort of, if you want to understand Tommy Lasorda, let me give you this story.
Tommy was probably the last celebrity manager. And by that, I mean, not only did he hang around celebrities, not only did he have a Frank Sinatra wall and a Don Rickles wall in his office with autographed photos and all that, he was a celebrity. I mean, he was a guy who could show up on a situation comedy or a variety show, and people would know who he was. People who didn't know anything about baseball would recognize Tommy Lasorda. And, what we knew about him out here, especially us covering the team, he had this reputation as baseball's ambassador, but he could be awfully foul-mouthed.
He might not be the ambassador you wanted.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, he would claim that his loving wife, Jo, didn't even realize he cursed. And my response was, I doubt that, since everybody else in Southern California had heard the tapes.
Yeah.
But the other thing about Tommy, and this sort of spoke to his skill as a manager and his skill with dealing with players. First thing he did after he took the job from Walter Alston, he moved his office from the little cubby hole at one end of the clubhouse to the big room at the other end that used to be Bill Bueller's trainer's room. Turned it into his manager's office, and he had he had desks in there, TV, what have you. He also had space to put the food spread. And
I've heard about the food.
He decided early on, I mean, the man loved his food, obviously. He decided early on that he was going to move the spread into his office. And that way, every player had to come in after the game, win or lose, to get the food. So that was his way of making that connection with his players. And to me, that's brilliant. I mean, it's, this was an era managers would come in after a tough loss. They'd tip over the food spread.
Yeah.
You never saw that in the Dodger clubhouse.
Yeah, at least not until he had gone through it, right?
Right. Well, he had too much respect for it. And the other great anecdote that came out of that chapter, he had a place in every city. I mean, he had a couple places in LA, and they were the ones that would cater the spread after the game. But he'd have a restaurant in every city. He hardly ever paid, okay? But AP had an interview with Charlie Gito, who runs a famous Italian restaurant in St. Louis. It's up on the hill. That's not a bad place. Tommy had his own table. Tommy had a phone on that table in case he needed to make a call. He'd come in before games with his entourage. That's 7, 8 people. They'd all sit down. And Charlie Gito's great line was, Tommy would order a salad, but then he'd taste some of what was on everybody else's plate. And at the end of the meal, he'd have eaten more than everybody else.
That's amazing.
He was one of a kind.
I mean, one of the things that stands out when I think about the Dodgers is the names, the icons, the faces, the personalities. And it's a nice segment to kind of say who are the top 4 people in Dodger history. And I won't force you to do that.
Please don't, because I don't know if you can.
But I mean, is there a guy on that list? If you were to put together a list, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10. Is there a guy on your list that might surprise some people? Where you're like, hey, this person doesn't get enough attention, enough respect in maybe just for their contribution to the franchise, maybe their contribution historically. Because obviously, again, Jackie Robinson, Tommy Lasorda, Hideo Nomo even, Fernando Valenzuela, Clayton Kershaw, Sandy Koufax, Don Drysdale. Like, there are those types of names that, of course, they would be on some form of a list. But are there people, is there a guy or even a girl maybe that in history and looking through the organization, the team, that you're like, this person, the more I read, the more I studied, the more I was around it, they don't get enough respect?
Wow. I don't know if I could answer that question off the top of my head because there are so many.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could have more than a wing of the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
With people who have played in Brooklyn and Los Angeles, whether it's for a career, for a year at the end of their career. I mean, a perfect example we saw last Friday night in Dodger Stadium, Albert Pujols. Yep. I mean, he spent 80-some games in a Dodger uniform, or he played 80-some games. He was beloved. Everybody in that clubhouse loved him. The fans loved him. I mean, the contrast between Albert Pujols as an Angel and Albert Pujols as a Dodger was striking. I mean, he came here and that clubhouse, that team invigorated him, and vice versa. I mean, I made the observation to Justin Turner that night that when Tio Albert was in the dugout, there were more hugs in that dugout than there had been at any time since Lasorda retired. Yeah. And it was just an equally beneficial arrangement between ball club and player. Yeah. So, and that's just one. I mean, there have been so many guys that, Ken Boyer just came to mind. I mean, there are guys, Boog Powell, Jim Tomei, guys who would spend like maybe the last year of their career in a Dodger uniform. And maybe they didn't have much of an impact, but the franchise was better for it. Yeah. And maybe those players are better for it too.
Yeah. It is amazing the number of Hall of Famers that even if they like you said, even if they didn't go into the Hall of Fame, so to speak, as a Dodger, the Jim Thomeys, the Manny Ramirez's of the world, who they make cameos. Greg Maddux, exactly. Guys that make cameos kind of at the tail end. So,
yeah.
Well, hey, I mean, you've got the book out. To somebody that's watching this, that's hearing the stories, and there you go. We got a copy right there. Like, what would be kind of the summary? If somebody's saying, I don't know, I'm on the fence about whether or not this is a book I would be interested in, what is Jim Alexander's sales pitch as we sit here today for why someone should consider it?
If you're interested in the Dodgers, you will be fascinated by this book because there will be things in here that you didn't know or didn't realize. And I think the reason that I enjoyed writing it so much, partially because digging into that history and finding out things that I didn't know.
Yeah.
But the other part of it is, and I don't mean to brag, but I wrote it in kind of a conversational style. So it's not this stuffy history book. Well, this happened in 1886 and this happened in 1889. And I'm using newspapers.com and baseball reference. And I'm giving you all these numbers and stats. And here's what happened in 1945. No, I mean, it's stories. It's stories about people. It's memorable people. It's people, some of whom had an outsized influence on this franchise. Some maybe didn't really have much of an influence at all, but they had great stories. And in the end, that's what this is. It's a book of stories about this team, about this tremendously interesting team. And if it were me, I'd buy it.
Where's the best place for people to go if they want to buy it?
Okay, the best way to do it is online. I don't know. It's a publisher that doesn't tend to put a lot of copies in bookstores. I mean, you can look, you can go to Barnes and Noble and ask for it, and I would just to see what the answer is. Any of the independent bookstores, especially here in California, Southern California, ask for it. Tell them you heard about it. Tell them tell them you're interested in it. I don't know, and I've sent emails out to all the independent bookstores out here to kind of get a sense of, are you going to order it? Are you getting any sort of groundswell of people asking for it? And to be honest, I don't know how much success we're going to have there. So probably the best way is to go through Amazon, go through Barnes and Noble. I mean, most of the bookstores that have online presence have the book available online, but with Barnes and Noble and Amazon, I'll let you in on a secret. I'd prefer that you buy the print copy, but if you want to buy the ebook and spend a little less, it's the same stuff. Yeah, you'll enjoy it just as much.
Awesome. Well, hey Jim, we appreciate your time. We appreciate all the time you spent writing, covering the Dodgers. We appreciate you putting a book like this together. So enjoy the rest of the season. Like you said, hopefully we get a World Series this year to cap it off, and maybe that could be a chapter for the next edition of your book.
I was just going to say, if this thing ends the way a lot of us think it's going to, then I may have to go back to my editor and say, can we do a second edition? So.
There you go. Well, Jim Alexander, sports columnist for the Southern California News Group. Jim, we appreciate your time, and best of luck. Enjoy the rest of the season.
Thank you very much. Good. Thank you for having me.